Greetings, Legionaries. Was reflecting on the quote by Clausewitz that war is a continuation of politics, and I think to myself, I think most people don't understand what politics is. Or rather, the term power, right? Political power. What are the outcomes of war? How do we evaluate a successful or negative action? How do we understand what our war goals should be? There's a lot of talk, especially on GunTube or your lowbrow military OSINT type accounts, who affect this self-perception of, how do you say, military competence. And this is true even in the military, especially in the military, where we make this mistake to think that the technique has really anything to do with the successful or unsuccessful outcome of a war. Vietnam is a prime example, but there are many other different cases. And I think this stems from, principally, especially in the United States, a misunderstanding of what power really is. And I think this concept, I really don't like the concept power as it's connoted in the West, especially because of the fact that nowadays we perceive it to be something Byzantine. It's always the pencil neck nerd schemer type behind the scenes that has all the power. But that's not the case. The reason why they have power is because they've deceived their superiors as to the true metric of power, what it is. Men of letters, leaders, officers, they've abandoned the realm of what is the political to people who shouldn't have it. And part of my project, of course, is reconstituting the Roman ideal of the Roman officer, warrior, being both warrior and commander, and also a politician, a political man, a powerful man. Someone who is able to conceive of military actions in furtherance of what is the military action for. Of course, there's something philosophically to be said about waging war for its own sake, and of course, I honor that and I champion that. But let's not get it twisted here. I think it's important that we understand what war really is about at the end of the day. At least on this earth, right? So unphilosophically, technically. And I was reading this book by Edward Luttwak. He has a number of great books out in general. He's a great scholar, historian. Of course, I don't share his personal convictions. He's a neocon, and he has really dumb takes, or at least from our position, dumb takes as an American. But I think you should be able to set aside his academic work with his personal opinion. And cleaving those two, I was actually reading one of his most interesting series, and of course he has a series, Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire, and Grand Strategy of the Soviet Union. All of these are incredibly salient. I started with Rome mostly because I was doing some research, but he has this great part in the appendix of this book, which elucidates as far as what are the dynamics of power. What does it mean? And I'm sure I've been scratching my head at it. I mean, hell, Sergeant Barnes sure as hell does. He finds his answers at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. But I myself have been reading. And I think the only closest approximation in a text form to what power is of course in Machiavelli, but you have to intuit what he means in that Machiavelli, whereas Luttwak is able to explicate it. And therefore, see, they attacked my fucking throat. Unbelievable. And therefore, I believe it was incredibly prescient and necessary for me to actually read this definition out to you. It's a short 3-page thing, but it'll be worth it, and we'll discuss it after. So stand by. I'm going to read it to you, and we'll kind of gestate it in the after effect. 1 second. Reading from Edward Luttwak now. Power and force, definitions and implications. Military power is normally defined, in functional terms, more or less as the ability of states to affect the will and behavior of other states by armed coercion or the threat of armed coercion. Such a definition clearly does not allow for any meaningful differentiation between power and force. Indeed, the quoted author immediately adds, it, in parentheses, military power, is equivalent to force, broadly defined. It is apparent that the power manifests in the Roman security systems under consideration, as indeed in almost all other conceivable security systems, is a phenomenon much broader than force, even if force is broadly defined. Power itself, power pour tout corps, is a French word, reading again, but always as relation rather than a unit of measurement, has been the subject of countless definitions, including some so general as to define very little indeed, e.g., man's control over the minds and actions of other men in a popular textbook. One modern definition analyzes the power relation in its components, treating power and action as a dynamic, manipulative relationship of which power to core is an instrumentality that includes diverse elements in a continuum from positive incentives to coercion. So, carrot stick, right? In this fuller definition, voluntary compliance is attributed to authority, while the absence of coercion or the threat thereof in non-voluntary compliance is said to reveal the working of influence. Okay? Other modern definitions deliberately combine the notions of power and influence, treating both as actor-directed relationships, whose nature can be viewed in terms of intuitive notions very similar to those on which the idea of force rests in mechanics. Newtonian mechanics, that is. Not surprisingly, less formal definitions obscure entirely any distinction between power and force, beginning and sometimes ending with a phrase such as, power is the ability to force. Now, these definitions may be adequate for a variety of analytical purposes, but not for our own. In seeking to evaluate the efficiency of the three systems of imperial security, it should be noted first that in these, as in all comparable systems of security, both ancient and modern, power as an aggregate of external action capabilities is the overall output of the system. The output is power rather than security, because the latter depends also on the level of the threat, a variable external to the system. Next, we observe that the efficiency of such systems is defined by the relationship between the power generated, output, and the cost to society of operating the system, input. These are both the direct costs of force deployments, military infrastructure, and subsidization, and the hidden costs that may be imputed to methods of discretionary defense, i.e., defense in depth and elastic defense, in which damage is inflicted on the society by enemy action that goes temporarily unopposed for strategic, systemic reasons. All else being equal, the efficiency of such systems must be inversely proportional to the degree of reliance on force, since the force generated will require a proportional input of human and material resources. In fact, the efficiency of the systems will reflect their economy of force. It follows that while in static perspective, force is indeed a constituent of power, in dynamic terms, force and power are not analogous at all, but they are rather, in a sense, opposites. One is an input and the other an output. And efficiency requires the minimization of the former and the maximization of the latter. Evidently, we cannot rely on definitions that nullify the difference in dynamic terms between force and power, and must provide our own definitions instead. Of course, the definition of force is by far the simpler. We know how force is constituted, in direct proportion to the quantity and quality of the inputs, whether these are legionary troops or armored divisions, auxiliary cavalry or helicopter squadrons, or at a different level of analysis, men and foodstuffs, or equipment and fuel. We know how force works by direct application on the field of battle or in active non-combat deployments. It is true that force also works indirectly, i.e. politically, since its mere presence, if recognized, may deter or compel. But the indirect suasion of force, though undoubtedly a political rather than a physical phenomenon, occurs only in the narrowest tactical dimension. Accordingly, while bearing in mind this qualification, we may treat force in operation as essentially analogous to a physical phenomenon, genuinely comparable to the concept of force in Newtonian physics. Both are consumed in application, both wane over distance to a degree that is dependent on the means of conveyance or the medium of transmission. Both are characterized by perfect proportionality between qualitatively equal units. In other words, military force is indeed governed by constraints on accumulation, use, transmission, and dispersion akin to the physical laws that condition mechanical force. How does power work? Very differently. First, it works not by causing effects directly, but by eliciting responses. Let me reread that. How does power work? Not force, power. Very differently. First, it works by not causing effects directly, but by eliciting responses, so psychological. If all goes well, the desired responses. The powerful issue an order, and those subject to their power obey. But in obeying, the latter are not the passive objects of the power relation, as are the objects of force. They are the actors, since those who obey carry out the required actions themselves. So what does he mean by this? He means specifically that power is not something that you affect. It is something which you psychologically cause a client or someone that perceives your power to be your superior to act in such a way which is to your will. So it's entirely psychological. It is their valuation of your power which affects their actions. It has nothing to do with your acts, aside from, of course, your verbal dictums, right? Continuing to read. The powerful, who merely issue the order, only have a static attribute, that is, quote-unquote, power. It is the actor objects of this power who supply the dynamic energy through their obedience. It follows immediately that the physical constraints, which impose a proportional relationship between the amount of force applied and consumed in this process and the results obtained, does not apply to the power relation. 1, 2, or 1,000 prisoners of war who walk to their place of interment in response to an order that they chose to obey do not consume the power to which their obedience is a response. In contrast, the physical removal of 50 demonstrators requires much less force than the removal of 50,000. In the latter case, there is a rigid proportionality between the force inputs and the output. In the former, there is no such proportionality. So what he's saying is basically, it's one thing, let's say you have a protest, right? It's one thing if you go as a member of a person with this power to go and say, okay, disperse, and they disperse. It's quite another thing to use the police officers to go down there and affect it. That is force. The former is power, the latter is force. So that's what he's trying to say, or rather what he's saying. Reading again. All this merely describes the power relation without explaining it. Next, we must ask why some men obey others, or, in other words, what the processes are whereby desired responses can be elicited in the minds of men, causing them to act in the manner required of them. Clearly, the actor objects of the power relation decide to obey, if we assume that they are rational. Their obedience, or lack of it, must reflect a comparison between the costs and benefits of obedience versus those of defiance. This comparison, this is in parentheses, this comparison may have been internalized into a mental habit, without obedience reflexive rather than deliberate. Such apparently instinctual processes merely reflect the ingrained results of prior comparisons of costs and benefits. At this point, it would seem that power is easily defined as the ability to control the flows of costs and benefits to others, with force being merely a subordinate ability to impose a particular kind of cost through coercion or destruction. If this were indeed so, then our analysis would have fruitlessly returned to its starting point. Remember that power and force are related. Reading again. And the differentiation here being pursued between power and force would have to be abandoned. For it would appear that the ability to control costs and benefits must be subject to the same limiting proportionality between inputs and outputs as the ability to apply force, or force to core. So what is he saying? He's saying that basically, if one were to believe these things are causal, as opposed to psychological, then there would be no difference between power and force, right? As we said earlier, which is the mistake that many military leaders think. It is our perception of power that affects our actions, right? And he'll go on to explicate the difference. But for instance, in the Roman Empire, Rome was constantly being assailed by low-level Germanic incursions over time that ground them down. But on the eastern side, the Persian Empire was able to have times of peace. Why is that? Well, he makes the case that the Persians had more conception of Roman power and therefore were more susceptible psychologically to the concept. The Romans had more force, and therefore they were more susceptible to the power, i.e., psychological perception of power of the Romans, and therefore the Romans were able to keep the peace with fewer legionary units, whereas in the West, the Germans just went gobble mode. They just didn't give a fuck. They just kept on attacking because they didn't have a wider conceptual horizon that the Persians had, and therefore the perception of power was always much minimized because the Germans always expected force to be made explicit to them. Okay? So you see this in Africa, for instance. Local warlords don't perceive American power as being very strong because they don't have wider conceptual horizons, and you see this especially in the French Algerian conflicts of the 1800s, because power was necessarily always something that had to be immediately obvious, as opposed to if you're a rational state actor, like for instance the Soviet Union versus the United States, they checked each other by power and perception, because both were intelligent and were psychologically understanding of the capabilities of force enacted by one or the other. I continue reading now. But this is not so. The ability to elicit desired responses through the decisions of the actor-objects of the power relation is plainly not a function of the ability to control costs and benefits, but rather a function of the perceived ability to do so. In other words, the first stage of the power process is perceptual, and the power is therefore initially a subjective phenomenon. It can only function through the medium of others' perceptions. Psychologically, what I've been telling you, psychology. If power is in the first instance a perpetual process, then distance will not diminish it unless the means of perception are correspondingly degraded over the distance. A remote eastern client kingdom would normally be closer to Roman realities in perceptual terms than the peoples beyond the Elbe, for in the East a Hellenistic civilization predisposed men to understand the meaning of imperial power, while no such cultural basis was to be found beyond the Elbe. It is true that the repeated punitive actions, as well as positive inducements, could teach even the most primitive of men the meaning of Roman power. But in that case, the power, quote unquote, so validated would be a different sort of phenomenon. Crucially, there would be proportionality between inputs and outputs, at least as long as the process of education continued. Perceived power does not diminish with distance, for it is not a physical or quasi-physical phenomenon. For the same reason, perceived power is not consumed by use. One client king or 10 can perceive the same undivided power in the empire and can be influenced by it. Nor is the quantum of this power diminished when the obedience of a further dozen client kings is secured by their own perception of the same power. Indeed, perception is one of the very few human activities, pace, the romantics, love is another, that does not consume its objects, even imperceptibility. By contrast, force applied on one sector to impose tranquility on one restless tribe is unavailable for simultaneous use against another. And any increase in the number of targets diminishes the amount of force that can be used against each. It is for this reason that the efficiency of systems of imperial security must depend on their economy of force, or, to put it differently, their efficiency depends on the degree to which force is maintained as an inactive component of perceived power rather than used directly. So what is he saying? He's saying that basically, I got 10 bullets. I have 20 sectors to cover. So in all reality, I only have one bullet for 10 sectors and the rest will be vacant. However, right, the perception of someone seeing, okay, there's a dude in this hallway that has 10 bullets. Well, if you're a smart dude, you wouldn't go in there because no matter which avenue you come down, you, in all probability, will be, you'll be liquidated, right? So there are a lot of implications. We'll get into this after, but let me continue reading. Once this is done, we'll kind of delve into what this really means fleshed out. Continuing to read Luttwak. If one excludes, for the moment consideration of all other components of power, that is static, perceived power, it may seem that once again the difference between the workings of power and those of force is inconsequential. For it is clear that in virtually all conceivable circumstances, deployed military force will be the central ingredient of the overall power of states. Accordingly, it would appear that it hardly matters whether security is obtained by the static deployment of force as perceived power or by its direct use. Not so. Even if one does not take into account the actual wear and tear that force must suffer, then actually used, casualties and material losses, force as power is inherently much more economical than force used directly, since it does not require proportionate inputs. For example, a given perimeter may be secured by means of an active defense, in which case the forces deployed must suffice to defeat all threats on every segment of the perimeter, or else it may be secured by deterrence, for which one need only deploy a punitive striking force capable of inflicting greater damage on the potential attackers than the gains the latter may hope to make by attacking in the first place. Inevitably, an active defense requires altogether greater force than does deterrence, for which credible retaliatory capabilities will suffice as assuming that one's opponents are rational and make predictable relative value judgments. In the first instance, security requires the protection of every single asset vulnerable to attack. In the second, it requires merely the recognized ability to destroy the enemy assets and inflict unacceptable levels of damage. Still, it must be pointed out that there is a qualitative difference between the security provided by deterrence and that provided by an active defense. The former, being the result of suasion, is subject to all the vagaries inherent in human perceptions and human decisions. The latter, being physical, is definitive. Prudent men may well choose to pay the greater costs of an active defense for the sake of its reliability, which is independent of the decisions of other men. This raises the entire broad question of error, beyond the specific case of cognitive time lags. If power can only be manifest through the medium of others' perceptions, then the translation of the objective, in quotations, and in parentheses, and by the same token theoretical, ability to control costs and benefits into the perceived ability of doing so is subject to multiple errors. Errors of physical perception, of the medium of communication, of cognitive processes, and of communication between perceivers. A blind man will not be intimidated by the display of a gun, nor a bank clerk by a gun too well concealed. While men ignorant of the chemistry of gunpowder may regard rifles as ineffectual clubs, and even those who understand it may fail to convey word of guns' lethality to other men who have never seen them, in such cases it may suffice to kill one savage, blind man, or bank clerk to educate the rest. But the exercise of suasion will have been invalidated, since force had to be used instead. Nor will symbolic force suffice in every case. Okay? Last 3 paragraphs here. Hang on there, legionaries. Is power then merely a perceptual phenomenon, and politics nothing more than a particular psychological phenomenon, and a narrow one at that? Surely not. So far, we have implicitly treated the power relation as bilateral, with a single controller of costs and benefits facing and being perceived by a single actor object of his power. Even when groups were hypothesized, they were treated as entirely monolithic, thus identical to individuals. But even if all politics could be treated as a sum of power relations, these relations would be, for the most part, not bilateral, but multilateral. Returning to the example of the client kings who individually perceived Roman power and individually obeyed imperial commands, there was an implicit assumption that the client kings did not also perceive the power of their fellow clients as being potentially additive and did not compare their total power to the power of Rome. Had such a comparison been made, the power of the empire would no longer have been seen as so totally superior. It follows that the power relation between the empire and the single client king was only procedurally bilateral. In fact, it depended on a variety of phenomena, most of them multilateral: the client's perception and calculation of his own power, of the power of other clients, of the possibilities of concerted action, of the risks, costs, and benefits of joint defiance versus the costs and benefits of obedience, and so on. All these factors are conditioned by the perceptions of individuals and the decisions of, in parentheses, and between groups. In other words, by all the processes of politics in their full diversity and inherent complexity, politics in the round ultimately determines the relationship between client states and empires. Most significantly, it determines the balance of power, which is a function not only of perceived power of the individual units in the system, but also the degree of cohesion between the clients and within the empire. In spite of importance of these complex relations, perception and the problems thereof remain central, and with them remains the distinction between power and force. End quote. Much to think, huh? This is actually very, very edifying. Holy shit. All right, boys. So I got to get my 2 brain cells rubbing. So I got to put this dip in. But let's masticate this, right? You know, all the BS aside with the fancy words and all that BS, let's actually make this tangible. You go to the bar, right? I know you boys throw down, so I know you know I have too. So let's be real. You're there with your boys. Your boys are kind of tough, but you get in like a little bit of a tussle. There's some assholes talking to you. Him and his boys, they're huge. They're massive. Let's just say they're like, I don't know, Jay Cutler style huge, right? All of them massive. Now, you get in a fight with them, you find out that they suck at fighting, and you beat their ass, you take their chicks, and you head home and you bang some sluts. Okay, cool. So let's like analyze what the fuck happened. Most people wouldn't fight someone that is taller or stronger than them because of their perception that they would get their ass kicked, right? That's called power. They have power. Power is perceived. It's psychological. It's my evaluating on this person. They didn't have to expend any of their force to tell me to fuck off if I were a coward, right? But I'm not. I'm a fucking psychopath, so I don't care. But as you see, when force met force between my boys and his boys, right? It turned out I kicked their ass. Okay? Okay, so what does this mean? It means that even though the quanta of force was decidedly in my favor at the end of the day because me and mine are more competent fighters, at first, the perception may be that they're more powerful. Now, extrapolate this to the wider political dynamic. There is a reason why countries like Egypt, for instance, and most countries, they have military parades, and like Kim Jong-un, for instance, the DPRK, great example, boom. Why does he have to make sure there's all these military parades outside of the internal political shit? Just think about it from this perspective. Why is it that he's constantly firing missiles? Why is it that he's constantly showing his best tech? Why is he showing to the world everything that he can do? He is trying to augment his perceived power amongst those. And it works. Do you know why it works? Well, because Americans really take them as a severe threat. So much so that we have an entire combat brigade team right there. We have strong alliance with South Koreans. We still believe them to be a viable threat, and therefore we posture and make sure that our force is arrayed to handle any contingencies that may come to fruition. But notice, we haven't gone to war with them since 1953. Like, we haven't been in combat with them on a large scale. Obviously, some skirmishes. Dude, I tell you, there are so many autistic spurgs that would be like, actually, forget the small details. Focus on the broad strokes. I'm going to stop qualifying everything I say just so that way I can avoid the smart aleck responses. Try to perceive the great strand that I'm trying to spin out for you here. The reason why the DPRK is doing this is because they want to augment their perceived power, right? And there's a reason why in psychological warfare, especially waged by foreigners on the United States, to be perceived to always elucidate, they write in their newspapers and all this other kind of stuff. The reason why they say that we're weak and that may be true. However, what they're trying to do is diminish the image of power America used to have. Right? In 1991, when we absolutely crushed the Iraqis, that was augmenting our power, even though, of course, we had to expend force. Ever since then, that illusion of power, especially after 2003, where we crushed Iraq for good, that illusion of power is what has been sustaining international relations for a long time, as in exuding American power, making weaker nations, especially in Europe, to be our bitch. Because, you know why? We crushed Iraq that had a 3 million man army with sizable munitions and everything in a weekend. who are you? And therefore their power. So it makes people become satraps, they become client kingdoms, and so on. Now, juxtapose this with, of course, the insurgents, right? Like the Islamic insurgents or whatever, the Taliban, right? The Taliban were doing what the Germans were doing. They didn't give a fuck. Like, they're like, I don't care if I die. Therefore, their perception of our power didn't matter. Why didn't it matter? Because it didn't enter their calculus, i.e., psychological perception of force that they could be leveled against, because they didn't care. And this is what Luttwak is talking about. He is saying that basically power and force are closely related. Yes, they're related, but they're not causally related. Does that make sense? So, you know, Nietzsche talks about this, where perception and actuality, often there is a big rupture where, because of our habituated fish in water syndrome situation, we believe that they're one and the other, okay? So what that means is that effectively we judge things based on our psychological perception of someone's power, of someone's strength, of someone's ability to crush me or kill me or something. But if you're a psycho or crazy enough, or if you have such strong convictions where that doesn't matter, it becomes the case that force itself becomes necessary, which is a losing situation, which is what the Roman Empire and the late Roman Empire found itself, is basically there are a bunch of psychopaths, crazy German dudes across the river that did not give a fuck. They lived to fight, they lived to die, and therefore the deterring power of Rome that worked so well on other nations that were bigger brained or nerds or were focused on money and feeling good, well, they had a psychological philosophy that it didn't matter. It wasn't necessarily that they were so primitive, because, as you know, Arminius was a Roman, right? I mean, he was a Germanic hostage brought up in Rome, and he knew better, but he still defeated the Romans, and he was still able to keep Germania from being colonized by the Romans. Why? Because he basically engendered in the Germans this feeling that the emperor wore no clothes. And so he was able to get men to act with their force against Rome and defeat Varus's legions, correct? So that's the consideration that we have when it comes to power and force, and what we must understand when it comes to war, that especially forget ideology and forget what we're trying to accomplish. There are limits to our force, and of course power is related to that, but it's also limited as well. So if you're waging war against someone who doesn't recognize your power, you're forced to use force. That force degrades over time, and no matter if you win tactically, you lose strategically, because you're expending your force, you're exhausting yourself. That's not the ideal situation to be in. And of course it's important to be incredibly powerful, to be incredibly capable of force. However, there's a limit to that. And so my perception of the situation is that basically there is a great power in philosophies and in men who don't care if they die, especially if they're in a political situation where dying is likely, because ultimately, as you see in Afghanistan, they won, right? Even though many hundreds of thousands of them died, they still won the strategic political victory. The Vietnamese, for instance, in the Vietnam War, we won every single force engagement, mostly. But the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, didn't recognize our power, and therefore were constantly pushing the edge, pushing the edge, pushing the edge. And finally, they manipulated us. They, obviously the communists subverted the United States. And so our will to use force degraded to the point where we abandoned the Republic of Vietnam to its fate, which today now is just Vietnam, right? The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, I think. Now, I know this won't answer all your questions, and in the coming series of Politeia, as I've elucidated before, we will be examining this through this lens. but always keeping in mind this question of power and force. How is it that we can augment our power so that way it psychologically causes people to acquiesce, right? When people say winning hearts and minds, it's not just about being a good dude or whatever. And like, yes, that's part of it. That's an inducement. But it's also, America lacks very much in the ability to coerce. Because whether you like it or not, war necessarily encompasses people that are non-combatants as well, who are usually the supportive elements of a war effort, right? And America's not willing to do that. And when they do attack civilians, it's by accident, and it causes people just to be more pissed off, right? So there's that common saying is either do no harm to an enemy or completely destroy him, for he can't he can't avenge himself. He can avenge himself from smaller slights, but from great ones he cannot. And that has been our mistake since the Korean War, of not understanding that we must unfortunately use force on non-combatants as much as combatants, because that is about engendering a psychological effect on the people, as well as, of course, trying to be nice to these people. So this is something we're going to go into, especially when we analyze the Afghan War and the Iraq War and Petraeus and the Surge and so on. But remember, the psychological perception is everything. And therein lies the answer to our questions of victory, whether it is defying a great power or engendering compliance in those who we might otherwise not be as capable of force as our perceived power. But if we're able to, make others perceive us to be very powerful, you see, just as in Eastern Rome, people will acquiesce because they believe you to be strong. So, right, perception is reality. Make a reality for someone to be perceiving you as very powerful, which is why I don't believe in humility, which is why I don't believe in a lot of things that Christianity teaches, precisely because it's a slave religion. And a slave religion is built on acquiescence. I want you to be powerful. I want you to have understandings of honor and to avenge yourself, because that is building up what is called deterrence, right? That's building up what is called power. If you are being punked right now, is precisely because you have no perceived power, right? And that's something that we have to delve into in a later episode. But Legionaries, I hope you can gestate this, masticate it further, ask any questions you may have, because I know this is complicated and a little bit confusing. Please comment. I'd be more than happy to elucidate on any points that you might need some help with. But until then, this is me, Sergeant Barnes, and this is Politeia on Lance's Legion, signing off.